Good morning. It is Friday, February the 18th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. Today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch and Americanism 100%. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work, thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now, the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 18th. Humility and submission to me will protect you. I have heard the desire of the humble, and I will prepare your heart and cause my ear to hear. I am great and mighty in power, and I will lift up the humble, but I will cast the wicked down to the ground. The highway of the upright avoids evil, and those who guard their ways preserve their lives. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. But how much better it is to be lowly in spirit, for I will instruct the humble in the way they should go. I will prosper them and bless the one who trusts only in me. You who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders, and clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For I will oppose the proud, but I will show favor to the humble. Humble yourself under my mighty hand, and I will lift you up in due time. Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15, Psalms 10, verses 17 through 18, and 147, verses 5 and 6. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. Prayer declaration. Father, in humility and submission I stand before you. I have prepared my heart to do your will and have strengthened my spirit to follow after your ways. Cover me with your protection, for I've submitted myself to you, to your word, and to your Holy Spirit. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 18th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you, thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. Thus, there are no solutions in the tragic vision, but only trade-offs that still leave many desires unfulfilled, much unhappiness in the world. What is needed in this vision is a prudent sense of how to make the best trade-offs from the limited options available and a realization that unmet needs will necessarily remain, that attempting to fully meet these needs seriatim only deprives other people of other such things, so that a society pursuing such a policy is like a dog chasing its tail. Thomas Sowell. There is no free lunch. Economics is the decision-making process embedded in human action. We price in risks and weigh them against hopeful rewards, and we do this with remarkable efficiency. We may misgauge a certain risk and find ourselves on the wrong side of a risk-reward trade-off, but that is the essence of economics. Trade-offs are not bad things. They are a fact of life. The only time trade-offs become unbearable is when we deny their basic inevitability to begin with. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, Americanism 100%. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, senile for years, was at last put to sleep in January 1975. A huge Democratic congressional majority had been elected in November 1974, and as far as it was concerned, anti-communism was nothing more than an excuse for wiretapping Martin Luther King and plunging the country into disastrous foreign wars. Worse even than the committee's work was its name. The crusading liberals of the new majority were offended and appalled by the notion that there existed such a thing as activities that were more or less American in any sense other than a geographic one. High on the list of rights endorsed by the 1972 Democratic campaign platform was the right to be different. And although the Democrats lost the 1972 election, they interpreted the 74 landslide as an acknowledgement by the American people that they had been right all along. There would be no more compulsory Americanism while they were in charge. Take that, J. Edgar Hoover. Good riddance, Roy Cohn. But J. Edgar Hoover and Roy Cohn did not originate the ideal of Americanism. Its roots sank far deeper into native soil, 100 years deep, and in uprooting it, the Americans of the 1970s tore up much more than the work of the tormentors of the Hollywood 10. The United States entered the 20th century about as badly divided as a great nation could be. The trees planted around the Civil War graves in Arlington Cemetery were still young in the 1890s. An 18-year-old who had joined the Blue or Gray in 1861 would have been 54 when President William McKinley, himself a veteran of Antietam, took the oath of office. In 1898, when McKinley sent the Army south to Florida for the invasion of Cuba, he worried that there might be a sabotage or harassment of the railway lines that ran through the old Confederacy. And across the old dividing lines of North and South, new fractures had cracked. The races were segregated by Jim Crow. The classes glared at each other across picket lines of America's uniquely bloody strikes. City dwellers who had access to electricity, central heating, telephones, running water, public libraries, streetcars, and theaters were resented by Western and Southern farmers who lived barely more comfortably than Daniel Boone a century before. The farmers in turn terrified the city dwellers with their mad demands for prohibition and monetary inflation. Frightening stories about bizarre and dangerous foreign ideologies filled the new daily newspapers. An adherent of one of those creeds, a Polish anarchist, had murdered President McKinley in April of 1901, the third president to die violently in 36 years. More than 20 million immigrants steamed into the United States between 1881 and 1914. Towns erupted into cities, cities into metropolises, and the streets of those metropolises were jammed with uncouth strangers in bizarre clothing, jabbering away in Czech, Magyar, Greek, Italian, Slovene, Ruthenian, Yiddish, and Romanian, and Lord knows what else. In the sepia photographs in our family albums, in the herky-jerky motion pictures we see in television documentaries, life in 1900 looks very quaint and picturesque. But at the time, it was alarming. How could a self-governing republic be sustained in a society whose people could not communicate with one another? Where some lived in the marble palaces of Fifth Avenue, while others starved. Where the president could not take for granted the loyalty of Southerners or immigrants if the country had to go to war. In a speech given after the United States entered the First World War, former ambassador to Germany, James Gerard, told an ominous story. The foreign minister of Germany once said to me, "Your country does not dare do anything against Germany, because we have in your country 500,000 German reservists who will rise in arms against your government if you dare to make a move against Germany." Well, I told him that might be so, but that we had 500,001 lampposts in this country, and that was where his reservists would be hanging the day after they tried to rise. The only way to sustain American democracy, the Americans of a century ago believed, was by forging a stronger sense of American nationhood. Quote, "We must Americanize immigrants in every way," unquote, Theodore Roosevelt declared in an 1894 magazine article. Quote, "In speech, in political ideas and principles, and in their way of looking at relations between church and state. We welcome the German and the Irishman who becomes an American. We have no use for the German or Irishman who remains such. We do not wish German Americans and Irish Americans who figure as such in our social and political life. We want only Americans. There are certain ideals we must give up. He must give up. He must revere only our flag. Not only must it come first, but no other flag should even come second. Immigrant absorption was only the beginning of nation building. North and South had to be reconciled. The class is brought together by a square deal. Responsibility for regulating the emerging national economy transferred from the states to Washington, D.C., racial violence in the South curbed, and alien ideologies banished. It was a program that made Theodore Roosevelt the most popular president of the entire century, from Andrew Jackson to FDR. The memory of the elder Roosevelt's accomplishments had faded over the years. He succeeded so completely that it is difficult now to remember the problems he set out to solve. From his day until the middle 1960s, the United States moved steadily and peacefully toward the unity and power he dreamt of. Labor relations were soothed, and the extremes of wealth and poverty narrowed. The racial caste system was overthrown. Hollywood, television, higher education, the interstate highways, and most important of them all, 2 world wars and the peacetime draft fused the country together culturally. Prosperity relegated anarchism, socialism, and communism to the margins of national life, leaving the center to a powerful consensus in favor of moderated and regulated free market capitalism. The First World War and the restrictive laws of the 1920s ended the Great Immigration. But by the middle 1960s, the United States was more uniformly English-speaking country than it had been in any time since the 1840s, and steadily becoming more uniformly so. The percentage of foreign-born in the population bottomed out at 5% in 1970. One still heard foreign languages spoken only in poor urban neighborhoods. In remote coal-mining towns, at the old folks' homes, Americanization had worked so stupendously well that the social critics of the 1950s fretted that their country was in danger of becoming too homogeneous. No fear of that. With not a word of apology to Theodore Roosevelt's unquiet ghost, the country's leaders began snipping one by one at the fibers of national unity after 1965. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. That year, Senator Edward Kennedy introduced a package of reforms to the immigration laws intended, he said, to purge them of their bias in favor of Europeans. In those days, immigration was one of those subjects whose very mention conjured up memories of a bygone era, like League of Nations mandates, white slavery, or railroad rate regulation. And Kennedy's bill moseyed through Congress without arousing much controversy or even interest. Fewer than 250,000 immigrants arrived in the United States in 1965. Kennedy solemnly promised that his bill would not cause the total to rise. Nor would it, he answered the Senate, much alter the ethnic composition of the country. The pre-1965 immigration law held overall numbers down because it offered almost all the available visas to European countries and to Canada, where population growth and unemployment rates were low. In fact, in 1965, many countries' allotted quotas went unfilled. Few West Germans felt the need to bid family adieu and learn a new language in order to settle in a country where wages were rising more slowly than they were at home. Kennedy's bill reallocated those unused quotas to poorer countries with higher population growth rates, and then reinforced the pro-third world tendency of the new law by giving first preference for all future visas to the extended families of the most recent arrivals. The annual intake of legal immigrants doubled between 1965 and 1970, and then doubled again between 1970 and 1990. Between 1964 and 1978, the number of illegal immigrants apprehended in or on their way to the United States jumped from 75,000 to more than 1 million. Between 1968 and 1990, counting both legals and illegals, some 30 million newcomers settled in the United States. Almost half of those people came from just one region of the world, Latin America and the Caribbean, and 20% of them from Mexico alone. In the 1976 movie Taxi Driver, Robert De Niro plays a character who is unusual in a lot of ways, but the one that may make the strongest impression on a 21st century audience is the one that the filmmakers probably considered least. He's white. Whoever sees a white cabbie in New York City anymore? The New York immigration transformed the American working class, darkening its skin and, by virtue of its immense numbers, deeply depressing its wages. So huge and so sudden was the movement of people that the state of California, the home of the Beach Boys' Golden California Girls, became in 1999 the first American mainland state to have a non-white majority. If immigration continues at its 1990s pace, and barring some unlooked-for upsurge in white birth rates, the whole United States, whose white population peaked at 90% of the total in 1940, will have a non-white majority by the year 2050. Relative to the size of the American population, the 1968-1999 immigration, huge as it was still smaller than that of 1881-1913. But unlike that early immigration, the post-1965 immigrants arrived in a country seemingly implacably determined not to assimilate them. That right to be different, the Democrat platform of 1972 had said, included the right to maintain a cultural or ethnic heritage or lifestyle without being forced into a compelled homogeneity. And though the Democrats lost the election, that part of their platform carried the day. 27 years later, presidential candidates were giving speeches in Spanish in order to be understood by the city or the country's growing non-English speaking minority. Many members of this minority had been born and educated in the United States. They retained their ancestral language because their new country had consciously chosen to instruct them in it. Bilingual classrooms had been pioneered in Arizona in the 1960s. Children were to be taught academic subjects in their own language, while their English was hastily brought up to par. What this tended to mean, given that the number of school hours is finite, was that the students began each day with 30 or 60 minutes of English instruction and then proceeded to math, history, science, and so on in their native tongue. Bilingual instruction spread rapidly across the country after the Supreme Court ruled in 1974 that the school board of San Francisco had violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act by plunging non-English speaking children into the same public school classes as everyone else. The court ordered San Francisco to make special accommodations for non-English speakers and suggested it take a look at bilingual education. The same mood of ethnic self-assertion that inspired the Chicanos of Arizona inflamed Spanish-language immigrants across the country. Money played its part. Bilingual education raised the demand for Hispanic teachers, and their pay too, since bilingual teachers usually received higher wages than their monoglot colleagues. The New York Board of Education acceded in August 1974 to the demands of Puerto Rican activists and instituted a plan immediately to put 200,000 students into bilingual classes. By the mid-1990s, almost one-third of California school children were enrolled in bilingual classes. Despite periodic reminders from the lower federal courts that bilingualism had been mentioned by the Supreme Court as only one alternative out of many, federal spending on bilingual education jumped from $7.5 million in 1968 to $150 million by 1979. The states, of course, spent much more. Back in a minute. Thank you. It quickly became obvious that the bilingual education was a misnomer. Not even California could guarantee children a place in a Tamil, Khmer, Armenian, Russian, Malay, or Eritrean language classroom. Instead, those Tamil, Khmer, Armenian, Russian, Malay, and Eritrean kids were placed in a Spanish language classroom. Worse, almost from the beginning, it was apparent that bilingual education did not work very well. Spanish speakers emerged from high school barely more fluent in English than when they entered kindergarten. But if bilingual classes did not teach English, they very effectively immersed their students in foreign nationalism, principally Mexican. On May 5th, the anniversary of the 1862 Battle of Puebla, the Great Mexican Patriotic Day, bilingual classrooms filled up with enough green and white flags and bunting to gladden the heart of Benito Juarez. The unwillingness to compel assimilation extended to adults as well as children. Over the 1970s, courts and bureaucracies step by step enlarged the political rights of non-citizens. In November 1971, a three-judge panel ruled that New York State's law restricting civil service jobs to citizens violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1973, the Supreme Court declared that aliens had a constitutional right to practice law. Nor, the court added in 1976, could they be barred from the federal civil service. The court did inexplicably rule in 1979 that the New York State could require high school teachers to be American citizens. By then, even the insistence that immigrants enter the country legally had become to seem unduly onerous. The phrase undocumented alien replaced the harsher illegal immigrant in official speech. President Carter, campaigning in California on the Cinco de Mayo holiday in 1979, personally committed himself to make sure all people within our borders, no matter how they may have gotten here, are treated with dignity and justice. I am committed to protecting the basic human rights of every person in this country, whatever their legal status. On November 26, 1979, Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti announced that the Immigration and Naturalization Service would cease to raid residences it suspected of harboring illegals. Searches would be confined to workplaces. The Supreme Court decided in 1982 that young illegal aliens have a constitutional right to a free public education. The collapse of the assimilationist project in some ways touched the native-born even more deeply than the new arrivals. The turn from integrationism to separatism that had convulsed civil rights organizations like the Congress on Racial Equality in the mid-1960s began to influence the broad mainstream of black opinion in the 70s. Separate black dormitories, pioneered at Cornell University in 1969, spread from university campus to another. Half-remembered, half-invented bits of Africanicity, like Kwanzaa holiday and the kente cloth, began to show up in middle-class black homes. New school curricula were drawn up, teaching that black Africans invented the smallpox vaccine and the telephone and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean 1,500 years before Columbus. Unfortunately, ethnic pride can all too easily boil over into chauvinism and xenophobia. The Los Angeles Times reported an increasing number of racially motivated assaults on servicemen in Hawaii by locals, 110 in the first 9 months of 1979, resulting in at least 2 deaths. 4 soldiers were mobbed and beaten by Hawaiian natives when they tried to come to the aid of a tourist whose purse had been snatched. 2 Army sentries were wounded by sniper fire from 16 teenage assailants. The violent American Indian movement provoked a prolonged standoff at Wounded Knee, site of the 1890 massacre by the U.S. cavalry that ended in a chain of shootouts with the FBI in May 1973. In 1981, the American Jewish Committee conducted a large survey of the prevalence of anti-Semitic attitudes in the U.S. population, the first such survey in 17 years. It found a gratifying drop-off in prejudice among whites, but reported with alarm that the level of anti-Semitism among blacks had remained unchanged since 1964. More alarming still, while anti-Semitic feeling declined among whites, the better educated they were, the well-educated blacks were every bit as prone to anti-Semitism as the less educated. These poisonous prejudices were abruptly exposed to public view in 1979 after President Carter fired UN Ambassador Andrew Young, the first black American to hold that office, for conducting secret and unauthorized meetings with members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Only one of the 9 major Jewish organizations in the United States had called for Young's firing, but the incident snapped something in Young's spirit and that of his old friends in the civil rights organizations. They were sick to the eye teeth of being reminded how grateful they should be. Appearing on Meet the Press on August 19, 1979, Young condemned Israel as stubborn and intransigent. 2 days later, Joseph Lowry, head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, met in New York City with representatives of the PLO and emerged to endorse Palestinian self-determination and to urge the PLO to give consideration to recognizing Israel. On a trip to the Middle East that summer, Jesse Jackson called Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin a terrorist and Israel a theocracy. Returning home, he met with an Arab American group and told them, "I can help your cause, but you have to help my cause by putting your efforts behind the civil rights movement." They immediately gave him $10,000 with the promise of more. Non-black Americans, meanwhile, were also jettisoning the old Rooseveltian ideas. The grandchildren of the Great Immigration reacted to the fading of the assimilationist idea with a defiant, if often hazy, new ethnic consciousness of their own. "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" t-shirts, gold crucifixes worn around the neck in defiance of America's Protestant sensibilities, gold Hebrew chai life symbols worn in defiance of the crucifixes. Often this new ethnic self-assertion was a hard-headed response to the new incentives created by affirmative action. Italian-American faculty pressured the City University of New York into recognizing them as an affirmative action category for purposes of hiring and promotion in December 1976. More often, the rewards for staking out claims of victimhood and separateness were psychic rather than material. They were, paradoxically, a way of finding a place for oneself in an increasingly balkanized America. One belonged by complaining that one never belonged. As for those who could not make the complaint, one could not excuse themselves as black or female or disabled or gay or the descendants of immigrants. They had 2 choices: either accept the role of villain or else start apologizing for all the dreadful things their ancestors had done during the course of building America. Back in a minute. Thank you. The identity politics of the 1970s sprouted into a rococo mass of tendrils, shoots, and curlicues. Accusations of racism were followed by charges of sexism, then of homophobia, then of ageism, ableism, lookism, and finally, inevitably, one supposes, of speciesism. Yes, really. The Australian philosopher Peter Singer coined the word in his bizarre but important 1975 book, Animal Liberation. Ironically enough, Singer now holds Princeton University's DeCamp professorship at the University Center for Human Values. The demand for equality is getting mighty exacting when human beings are told not to feel superior to chickens, but these movements were not about equality. The new identity politics was yet another late 20th century throwback to the ideas and prejudices of the late 19th century, in this case, to social Darwinism. Social Darwinists envision nations and their peoples as constantly struggling for their existence against other groups. According to the more radical social Darwinists, there were no universal truths, only the unique experiences of particular groups. Language, the ultranationalist German historian Heinrich von Treitschke declared, is directly given to consciousness in association with reason. The concept cannot be detached from the word and, differences of language inevitably imply differing outlooks on the world. The feminist theorist Catherine A. McKinnon endorsed a similar point of view a century later. The white man's standard for equality is, are you equal to him? That is hardly a neutral standard. It is a racist, sexist standard, but if you present yourself as affirmatively and self-respectingly a member of your own culture or sex, if you insist that your cultural diversity be affirmatively accommodated and recognized in ways equal to theirs, in equal to the way theirs has been, that's not seen to be an equality challenge at all. McKinnon believes that members of each culture, her word for what Treitschke would call each Volk, had their own distinct moral and intellectual norms. If an essay she claims that 13% of all American women, or more than 18 million people, have at one time or another in their lives worked as prostitutes, and if she cites as her only authority for this improbable claim an article in a student newspaper, then while she may be guilty of flouting white male standards of evidence, she has not fallen short of standards of evidence in general, because there are no such things. Just as there were once German physics in which atoms behaved in certain ways, and Jewish physics in which they behaved in other ways, so there are white male standards of evidence which rely on FBI reports and police blotters and what? White female standards of evidence? Apparently so. The entire project of building a new kind of left-wing movement had begun with a moral worry about being privileged in a world of suffering. Paul Berman explains in his History of the Generation of 1968. The idea had been to take privileged young people and put them on the side of the oppressed, on someone else's side, not their own, on the side of people who needed help. But the argument for feminism and gay liberation said, in effect, that in the student world, everybody was not, on closer inspection, so wonderfully privileged. On the contrary, they would, thank you very much, take their own side, and militantly so. Their words may have been borrowed from Marx, but their feelings came straight from Commodore Decatur. My sex, race orientation, may it always be right, but my sex, race orientation, right or wrong. And that was Americanism 100% from the book How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that seeks consensus. He is subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He's informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He's impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He's deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He's skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains
Thank you, thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.